Hello, my name is Jonathan Mitchell and I'm going to be talking to you today about how to improve your smartphone photography. Smartphones are amazing devices for photography. You can take as many shots as you like, experiment with different techniques, and you can immediately see the results of those experiments and therefore learn in a really quick way. They do have some limitations, and we're going to talk about those today and how to work within those limitations and how to circumvent some of them to some degree. So let's get started. The first thing you should always do when doing any smartphone photography, and this will have a big impact on how your images look, is clean your lens. So you get one of these, a lens cloth. If you haven't got a lens cloth, you can use the corner of a soft t-shirt or just a soft cotton fabric and just give your lens a good old wipe. Give it a good rub there, because every single time you pick up your smartphone, or put it in a bag, take it out of a pocket, the chances are you're touching the lens. And when you touch the lens, you're putting dirt and grease over the lens, and then when you shoot through those, the light has to travel through those and it's going to become distorted. So you will end up with images that are not as crisp and clean and clear as you'd hope. But give it a little clean, 5 seconds, boom, you're already on your way to better photographs. Second thing is how to hold your smartphone. You see everybody doing this. Arm's length, camera out, click. The problem with that is that the further away from your body the camera is, the more likely it is to shake around. And if you have a shaky camera, you end up with fuzzy, blurry images. Not what you're looking for. So, how do we hold a smartphone? Instead of doing this, you're going to bring your arms in, elbows in tight, close to your rib cage, camera here. You can hold the camera with 2 fingers, hold the other side as well, and then you've got your thumb free, ready to press the shutter button. And that is going to get rid of a lot of potential camera shake and keep your images nice and crisp. The third basic thing you can do before you even think about what kind of photographs you're taking is something to do with the lens. You see, smartphones have wide-angle lenses built in. Now, wide-angle lenses are great if you're shooting landscape, street scenes, and you want a wide field of view in your image. Where they fall down a little is in portraits and close-ups. You see, with a wide-angle lens, the closer the subject comes to the lens, the more distorted the features become. So you can see here now my nose looks enormous. No jokes about that, please. Thank you very much. Whereas my ears look comparatively smaller. And as I say, that's because a wide-angle lens will magnify things that are close to the camera and minimize things that are further away. So we can get around that by zooming in a tiny bit. Most smartphones will have a movable lens. Now it only moves a small amount because the camera is so thin, there's not much room for it to move in and out. So you don't want to zoom in too far, because if you're going too far, it'll switch to the digital zoom, which is basically just blowing up the image. And that's going to lead to pixels that are over visible. It's going to lead to graininess and loss of color. So you just want to zoom in a little bit. And I'll try and show you here now. Click on my screen there, and if I do the old pinch, a minute. Here we go. So if I zoom in there, you can see I've got a little circle here. And that's showing me how far I've zoomed. Now I've zoomed in a bit too far there. I've gone way over halfway. You see where that is? That's gone too far. It's going to have switched to digital zoom. So what I'd recommend is about 25%, or about a quarter along the way of that bar. So if I bring that out a bit there, you can see there I'm about a quarter of the way along the bar. What that's going to do, it's going to switch from being a wide-angle lens to being more of what we call a standard lens, which has a lot less distortion, and that's going to really help if you're taking close-ups or portraits. But as I say, be careful with it, don't over zoom in, otherwise you're going to end up with poor image quality. So that's your basic housekeeping. Clean your lens, hold your camera steady, and zoom in a little bit unless you specifically want the wide angle. So, on to the actual shooting. Let's talk about composition. Composition is how you frame your image. So it's about where you place the elements of your photograph within the frame, and it's about how those things relate to one another. And it can really have a big impact on the arresting qualities of your photographs. Now, the first and simplest element of composition is which way up do you have your phone? Do you have it in landscape mode, horizontally, or in portrait mode, vertically? That can make a big difference to your image. A lot of landscape photographers would shoot in that horizontal landscape mode. That's why it's called that, because you get a lot of horizontal information, like the horizon, for example. Whereas portraiture, human beings, we tend to be vertical creatures, and therefore the portrait or vertical mode suits our proportions. It can also have other effects, which format you choose, but I'll talk about the proportions first. So here's a couple of examples. There's two different shots of the same subject that I shot, of a theatre front. So the first one is up in landscape mode, and you know, it's not bad. It's well exposed and there's nice colour in it, good detail. But you'll notice if you look closely that there are lots of vertical elements in this picture. So there's a porch sticking out over the front door, and there are vertical columns coming down from that, and above that there are vertical columns in the brickwork on the frontage of the theatre. And once you notice that, you can see that because we're shooting in landscape mode, it chops off those nice vertical lines and it just doesn't quite sit right. So I'm going to show you the second one now, which was shot in portrait mode, and you can see that it really echoes and complements those vertical lines. So it's really about looking closely at your subject and seeing which format, whether landscape or portrait, is going to suit the subject that you're shooting. And you can try both and look back at them afterwards and see what you think. And this is how you can learn these techniques. But photography is really about seeing. And if you get into the habit of seeing before you take your shots, this is when you really start to take photographs rather than just press buttons. There's another element that choosing which rotation of the camera you have can really affect your image. So I'm going to show you another two pictures here. Again, it's the same image, just shot in different rotations. So I'll put the first one up now in portrait mode. This is Brown Bear. He's a member of our family. He comes everywhere with us, and here he is on holiday with us, sitting on his sun lounger on the beach. Now, it's shot in portrait mode. It's, again, nicely exposed, good colours and so on. But really, because of the constraints of portrait, it's just a profile, side-on shot of a stuffed teddy bear. But if you look at the next one, which we've shot in landscape, it opens up the picture so much because there's all the space off to the right of frame as you're looking at it, leading along the beach and off towards the sea. It draws the viewer's eye along Brown Bear's gaze. We actually almost put ourselves in his place and imagine ourselves looking out to sea, and we start to wonder what he's looking at. We start to imagine what he's looking at. What is he seeing? What is he thinking? And it adds a sort of sense of wistfulness and playfulness to the image that just isn't there in the portrait mode. So again, careful choices about which orientation you choose can really change not only the compositional look of the image, but can actually change how you feel about it when you look at it. Okay, so that's portrait and landscape mode. So that can have a big difference, a big impact on your images. The next thing I want to talk about is a thing called the rule of thirds. A lot of photographers talk about this. So basically, if you take a photograph and your subject is bang in the center, right in the mathematical center of your image, it's what we call the dead center. And the reason we call it the dead center is because subjects placed right in the center of frame tend to lose a bit of energy, a bit of dynamism, because there's an equal amount of space all around them. The energy tends to leak out the sides of the photographs. Not always. Again, this is an aesthetic choice. But the rule of thirds is a system where photographers basically visualize a kind of grid of lines across the frame. And these lines are spaced 1/3 from each side inwards and 1/3 from the top and the bottom of the frame. So if you imagine a box of these lines drawn in, and then photographers will place important elements of an image along these lines, and it really opens up the photograph. It gives a sense of energy and dynamism, and can really start building sort of narratives into your images. So I'm going to put one up here as an example. This is an old car lot, as they call them in America, I think, or a garage selling used cars that had gone derelict. Now it was night time, so there was very limited light. I was relying on a street light coming in, and I had to hold the camera extremely steadily. But you can see that the sign, which is the main element of our photograph, is exactly 1/3 of the way down. I'll show you another photograph in a second of the same one, but with the lines drawn on Photoshop, and then you can actually see how they correspond. And placing that sign 1/3 of the way down rather than in the dead center does two things. One, it's where your eye looks at a photograph instinctively. It doesn't look at the center, it looks at these thirds. So your eye is drawn to it naturally because that's where you want to look. The second thing it does is it gives us a lot of space beneath the sign, which is filled with this dead, brown, desiccated grass. And it's that really gives us the sense of decay and deconstruction that is present in the photograph. If I'd shot this in the daytime, I could have framed it completely differently, because you could have seen the vacant lot in front and the bits of building rubble strewn around and the empty forecourt in front of the sign. None of that was visible because there wasn't enough light to light those things. There was just enough to pick up that grass, and that really gives it that sense of abandonment, which is an aesthetic I'm personally very drawn to in my photography, but it's not to everyone's tastes. But you can see now, here's the second version of the image with the lines drawn on, and you can see where important elements, there's a large chain link triangle that's also positioned right on one of the lines of thirds. So you can really use these things, use these little techniques to visualize where you're going to place your subject in the frame and get a sense of what that does to the tension in the image. So that's the rule of thirds. They call it a rule of thirds. Rules are there to be broken. You don't have to stick to it, but take this idea and try it out. Try the same photograph without using the rule of thirds and have a look and see what the difference is. And that'll really sort of start to develop your eye, as they call it among photographers. Now, so those are the two main compositional elements I wanted to talk about, the rotation of the camera and the rule of thirds. We're on to light now, and light is really the most significant part of any photography, because photography itself, a photograph, is really just captured light. So light is the most important thing. Professional photographers will spend a fortune on devices to enable them to control light. Flash heads, studio lights, umbrellas, reflectors, all of this expensive equipment is designed purely to give them control over light, over the direction of the light, the intensity of the light, the angle, the quality. With a smartphone, you don't get any of those luxuries. You're really working with available light. I wouldn't recommend using the flash on your smartphone. It's terrible. It's not color balanced, so your colors all come out wrong. It's really intense over a very short distance and then falls off drastically. So I'd leave flash alone and just get used to working with the light that's in your environment. Now that might be an overhead light in your sitting room. It could be the sun if you're outdoors. It might be diffused light if there's cloud and it's overcast. So what you really want to start doing is practicing becoming aware of the light. Where is it coming from? What direction in relation to the camera? Is it behind the camera? Is it shining towards the camera? Is it coming on from the side? Is it intense light? Is it soft light, like you'd get on a cloudy day? So once you start noticing these things, you can start making choices about where you want to position the camera. Sometimes you can move the subject. If, for example, you're taking a portrait, you can direct your subject into an area where you prefer the light. So very hard sun, for example, very bright sun will give you really strong shadows, and that's not the most flattering. You might get dark under the eyes, dark shadows behind the nose or under the nose. So you could move them into a shaded area, or a doorway is a great idea, because that casts a bit of a uniform shadow, the light softens, and you lose a lot of that harsh contrast. But very often you can't move the subject if you're photographing a bridge, or a building, or a postbox. So what you can do is you can move the camera. Okay, so let's talk about what the different kinds of light do. If the light is behind the camera, shining on to the subject, you get a nice even light, and you're going to get lots of detail and information. You're going to see lots of colours strongly represented. You're going to see all the fine details. If the light is coming in from the side and hitting the subject side on, you're going to get more contrast. You're going to get darker shadows and brighter highlights. If the light is behind the subject, shining towards the camera, the subject is going to be in shadow. Quite often they're going to be silhouetted, particularly on a strong day. Now these are choices. You might like this, you might want that effect. So let's have a look at a couple of images that illustrate this. So this first one I'm putting up here now is an archway, an old ruin that I photographed. And you can see that the sun here, as it's coming down, is behind the subject, which is the archway, shining directly towards the camera. So it's hitting the back side of the archway from the point of view of the camera, which means all that beautiful sunset light is hitting the wrong side, if you like. So what we're getting is a silhouette. Now the benefit of a silhouette is it really accentuates form. So we really see a strong arch shape, but we don't get much detail. There's hardly any colour in there. The archway, you don't see any of the fine detail in the stonework. You don't see the crumbling edges. You just really get a strong sense of the form of the thing. Now, the second photograph I'm going to put up here illustrating this point was taken a few seconds later, and I walked through the archway, turned my back and faced the other way. So now the sun is behind me and behind the camera, shining directly on the subject. And here you'll see you've got loads of colour, loads of detail, loads of information. It's a very different picture with a very different feel. But what you don't get is quite such a strong sense of the shape of the thing. The form isn't as strongly represented because there's lots of other detail going on around the archway. So neither of these is right or wrong, but I just want to give you some examples of the difference such a small thing as changing your own position, your own viewpoint can make. And particularly with regard to light, this is important because, as I say, seeing the light, seeing where it's come from, being conscious of this, and then incorporating that into your photograph is really how you're going to get some great photographs captured. Now, compositionally, there are other things you can play with as well. So, how close or far from a subject you are is going to make a big difference. Let's take close-ups for an example. Here's an image I shot. It's really just a patch of long grass at the side of the road. You'd probably walk past it and not even notice it most days. But there was a particular sunny day. I saw it there and I saw the blue sky above, and I thought that could make a really nice kind of almost abstract study of form. So I got in super close. I got down on my belly and cropped out everything else, so all you've got is the grass and the sky. The sky is a nice blank background. So really what you're looking at here in this image is the form of the grass. Those sharp, vertical daggers of the grass blades striking up into the sky. And then you've got the colours, the green and the blue. So it's kind of almost an abstract study in form and colour. And that's come about purely by getting in really close and getting right down to the subject. So again, this can influence the kind of images you're going to get. Don't just take the shot from where you are, move around, change position, get in closer, be a little further back, and see what that does to the composition of your image. Another great trick is to play with things like reflections and windows, because glass in particular can be fabulous to shoot through, because you get all sorts of effects from the light as it hits the glass. So here's another shot. I saw an abandoned antique shop, and when they bailed out, they'd left a huge pile of keys in the window. This was a really old building, so the glass was kind of warped in places, and that was affecting the light as it came through. There was dirt and patches of grime on the glass, and this also affected where the light fell. So shooting through that, it really diffused the light and softened it, and gave me all these kind of little reflections and refractions that really kind of gave that bunch of keys a sense of something slightly mysterious maybe that wouldn't have been there if I'd just had a bunch of keys on a table and I was shooting it directly. So again, this is another thing you can play with, the idea of shooting through objects or using objects to frame your actual subject. I'll give you another thing you can look for here. Form is great to play with. So the shapes of things. Lines can be amazing for taking your viewer's eye on a journey through the photograph. So here's another example. This was just a little brick path in a garden I happened to spot. But the way the sun was coming down, it was quite dark. All the forest or the trees and the bushes around were quite dark. But the light was hitting the path just so that the orange bricks really popped. And then it deepened into shadow as the bricks went underneath the trees, underneath the foliage. So you really get a sense here that you're being taken on a journey through this photograph. What's inside the forest, inside those trees? It's like taking your first steps on Red Riding Hood's path through the forest to see her grandmother. So, you know, you're really allowing that line of the bricks to take the viewer on a journey. If I'd shot that from the side and the line was coming across the frame, it would have been a completely different photograph. And then one other thing I want to talk about is colour contrasts. So the final image I'm going to put up here is just a few autumn leaves that had fallen on a canal and been pulled into a corner by a current. So here you've got form and colour. So you've got a beautiful kind of sinuous curve that's drawn by the leaves as they've been pulled into shape, and that contrasts with a really sharp vertical spike, which is the reflection of a street light. And then in terms of colour, you've got this really kind of lead grey, neutral water, and then you've got the fiery orange of the leaves in contrast to that. So it really kind of brings what is a very ordinary subject to life, because there's this tension between the brightness of the colour and the neutralness of the colour, and then the softness of one form and the sharpness of another form. So these are things to look out for. Form, colour, line, reflections, looking through other objects, getting closer or getting further away. It's really about playing with the world. Once you start looking at the world through a lens, you really start to see it differently. And smartphones are an amazing tool for exploring that world visually. As I say, because you can play and play and play, and all you need to do is charge your battery. So hopefully I've given you some ideas. Get yourselves out there and get taking pictures. Socially distance, be responsible, stay safe. But even in your own home, you can pick up the sunlight coming through the blinds and hitting shadows on the wall. Shoot that. Or an abstract close-up of a coffee cup. So these are all things you can do. You don't have to get outside. You can work inside the confines of your own home and just play. Have great fun. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope your interest in photography grows and grows. Thank you very much.